It weighed 160 pounds, a monster of muscle, scars, and teeth that terrified even the hardest outlaws in Oakland. They said it only knew how to kill, but they were wrong. It took a homeless, mute 14-year-old boy, armed with nothing but silence, to break the beast. The heat coming off the asphalt in the industrial sector of East Oakland was enough to warp the horizon. Here, surrounded by rusted-out auto body shops and abandoned manufacturing plants, sat the heavily fortified compound of the Hells Angels. It wasn't just a clubhouse, it was a fortress. High cinder-block walls, topped with coils of razor wire, guarded the perimeter. Security cameras swept the street with mechanical indifference, but the real security, the thing that kept local street gangs, curious onlookers, and even the Oakland Police Department at a healthy distance, wasn't electronic. It was biological. His name was Aries. Aries was a Presa Canario, a breed originally designed for driving cattle and fighting in the pits of the Canary Islands. But Aries was a mutant among his own kind. Tipping the scales at an astonishing 160 pounds, he possessed a head the size of a cinder block, with dead, amber eyes that seemed entirely devoid of canine affection. His coat was a brindle mix of muddy browns and blacks, crisscrossed with jagged white scars from his previous life in the underground dogfighting rings of Vallejo. The dog belonged to Tommy Gallagher, a volatile, heavily tattooed enforcer for the chapter. Tommy, known on the streets as Tommy Gun, had won the dog in a high-stakes poker game from a mid-level cartel affiliate. Tommy didn't want a pet, he wanted a weapon, and Aries delivered. The stories surrounding the dog were local legends, whispered in the dive bars down on San Leandro Street. There was the time a repossession agent, a hefty guy named Richie, made the catastrophic mistake of hopping the outer fence to check the VIN on a disputed Harley-Davidson. Aries hadn't barked. He hadn't growled. He had simply appeared from the shadows, hitting the man with the force of a freight train. Richie spent 3 months in the ICU and lost the use of his right arm. Another time, a pair of rival bikers from the Vagos Motorcycle Club threw a Molotov cocktail at the compound's gate. The bottle shattered, but before the flames could catch, Aries was over the low section of the inner fence. He dragged one of the attackers off his idling motorcycle by the collar of his leather jacket, nearly tearing the man's throat out before Tommy whistled him off. Even the Hells Angels themselves gave the dog a wide berth. When Aries was chained to the heavy iron engine block in the center of the yard, the brothers walked around the perimeter. He wasn't loyal to the patch. He was loyal only to Tommy, and even that loyalty was built on a fragile foundation of dominance and fear. 3 miles away, in the damp, trash-strewn alleyways behind a string of decaying strip malls, lived Caleb. Caleb was 14 years old, though his stunted, malnourished frame made him look closer to 10. He was a ghost of a boy, dressed in clothes scavenged from donation bins, baggy denim jeans frayed at the heels, and a faded gray hoodie that he kept pulled up over his messy, dirt-brown hair, regardless of the California heat. But the most defining characteristic of Caleb wasn't his poverty. It was his silence. Caleb hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years. Psychiatrists in the Contra Costa County foster system had diagnosed him with severe selective mutism, a trauma response triggered by a violently abusive upbringing and the sudden overdose of his mother. After bouncing through 5 foster homes, each worse than the last, Caleb had done what many broken children do. He vanished. He slipped out of a ground-floor window of a group home in Richmond and never looked back. The streets of Oakland were merciless, but Caleb possessed a unique survival trait. Because he had abandoned the spoken word, his other senses had sharpened to an extraordinary degree. He observed the world not through what people said, but how they moved. He understood micro-expressions, the shifting of weight, the dilation of pupils, and the tightening of jaws. He understood the unspoken language of intent. This hyper-awareness extended naturally to the feral animals that shared his urban purgatory. Caleb had an uncanny affinity for the broken, discarded dogs that roamed the alleys. While animal control officers chased strays with catch poles and pepper spray, Caleb would simply sit on a discarded milk crate. He would lower his gaze, turn his shoulders sideways in a display of non-aggression, and wait. Within minutes, fearful, snapping pit bulls and paranoid shepherds would creep forward, eventually resting their heads on his ragged sneakers. To Caleb, human words were nothing but lies and manipulation. The language of Dobbs' energy, posture, and eye contact was pure truth. He survived by collecting scrap metal, hauling a rusty shopping cart through the industrial zones, picking up discarded copper wire, aluminum cans, and cast-off auto parts to sell at the recycling center by the docks. It was a meager existence, completely invisible to the powerful forces operating in the city. He didn't know about the Hells Angels. He didn't know about Tommy Gallagher. And he certainly didn't know about the 160-pound monster chained to an engine block waiting for a kill. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon when the invisible boundaries of their worlds violently intersected. Caleb was pushing his squeaking shopping cart down an alleyway that ran parallel to the rear of the Hells Angels compound. His eyes, always scanning, caught the glint of sunlight bouncing off machined steel. Just inside the compound's outer chain-link fence, resting in a patch of dry weeds, was an alternator. To a scrap metal scavenger, a heavy, copper-wound alternator was equivalent to finding a $20 bill lying on the pavement. The outer fence was old, erected long before the club had fortified the main clubhouse. In one corner, the earth had eroded beneath the chain link, creating a gap just large enough for a scrawny 14-year-old boy to slide through. Caleb abandoned his cart. He dropped to his stomach, the hot dust coating his forearms, and wriggled under the metal mesh. He stood up inside the perimeter, dusting off his jeans, his eyes fixed purely on the prize. He walked toward the alternator, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed into the yard of the most dangerous motorcycle club in the world. 60 yards away, sitting on the shaded concrete patio of the clubhouse, Tommy Gallagher was nursing a warm beer. Beside him sat two other patched members, a giant of a man named Dutch and a prospect known only as Rat. They were laughing loudly over the roar of a V-twin engine being tuned in the adjacent garage. At the edge of the patio, resting in the dirt, was Aries. The dog's ears twitched before his eyes opened. A heavy mastiff lifted his massive, scarred head, his nostrils flaring. He caught the scent of unfamiliar sweat, dirt, and fear. Aries stood up, the heavy steel chain clinking against his leather collar. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest, a sound so deep it felt like an approaching earthquake. Tommy stopped laughing. He followed the dog's gaze across the sun-baked dirt yard. He squinted through the heat haze and saw the small, hooded figure reaching down to pick up the alternator. "Well, look at the balls on this little rat," Dutch muttered, leaning forward in his plastic lawn chair. Tommy smiled, a cruel, uneven stretching of his lips. He was bored, the heat was making him irritable, and someone was stealing from his club. He didn't see a starving child, he saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Hey!" Tommy shouted, his voice echoing across the yard like a gunshot. Caleb froze. He clutched the heavy alternator to his chest and looked up. Through the shimmering heat, he saw the three large men. But more importantly, his eyes locked onto the colossal, brindle beast standing beside them. "You lost, kid?" Tommy yelled, standing up. He reached down to the heavy iron carabiner connecting Aries's chain to his collar. "Nobody steps foot in this yard." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to dive back under the fence and disappear into the alley. But he was paralyzed. The sheer size of the dog defied everything he knew about street animals. "Let's see how fast you run," Tommy sneered. With a sharp click, he unhooked the carabiner. "Get him, Aries." The release of tension was explosive. Aries didn't just run. He launched himself. The massive Dobbs' claws tore chunks of dirt from the earth as he accelerated. A heat-seeking missile of muscle and rage locked onto the fragile figure in the gray hoodie. The distance closed in seconds. 60 yards, 40 yards, 20. Dutch and Rat stood up suddenly uneasy. "Jesus, Tommy, it's just a kid," Dutch said, the amusement draining from his voice. "He's gonna tear him to pieces." "Should have thought of that before he climbed our fence," Tommy replied coldly, crossing his arms. Caleb stood perfectly still, the world around him slowed down to a crawl. The roaring of the motorcycle engine faded away. The shouting of the men vanished. All that existed was the charging beast, its jaws parting to reveal thick, yellowed canines, ropes of saliva flying from its jowls. "Run," the word echoed in his mind, but his legs refused to obey. Then something extraordinary happened. The survival instincts that had kept Caleb alive on the streets of Oakland overrode his human panic. He stopped looking at the dog as a monster and began reading it as an animal. He saw the stiff, upright tail. He saw the hard, fixed stare. He saw the forward-leaning weight. It was a purely dominant predatory charge designed to chase down fleeing prey. Prey runs. Caleb dropped the heavy alternator. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't raise his arms to protect his face. Instead, Caleb exhaled a long, slow breath, visibly dropping his shoulders. He turned his body slightly sideways, presenting a narrower, less threatening profile. He lowered his chin, completely breaking eye contact with the charging mastiff, staring softly at the dirt a few feet in front of him. Finally, he extended his right hand, palm open, and facing the ground, a universal sign of passive energy. He became a statue of total submission. 10 yards away, Ares braced for the impact, expecting the boy to bolt, scream, or fight. He expected resistance. He was bred for resistance. The resistance never came. At 5 yards, the sudden lack of chaotic energy threw a wrench into the dog's predatory sequence. The target wasn't acting like prey, nor was it acting like a challenger. It was just still. Ares slammed his massive paws into the dirt, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust. He skidded violently, his powerful hind legs sliding sideways. He stopped mere inches from Caleb's worn sneakers, his chest heaving, his jaws mere centimeters from the boy's unprotected thigh. Back on the patio, Tommy Gallagher's jaw dropped. Dutch swore under his breath. They waited for the inevitable bloodbath. They waited for the dog to lunge and crush the boy's femur. Through the settling dust, Caleb remained completely motionless. He didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He kept his head bowed, his breathing deep and even, radiating an aura of absolute profound calm. He was projecting a silence so deep it bordered on the spiritual. Ares let out a confused, rattling breath. He sniffed Caleb's jeans, inhaling the scent of dirt, old grease, and a complete, baffling absence of adrenaline. The dog's ears, previously pinned flat against his skull in attack mode, slowly swiveled forward. The tension in the mastiff's spine began to uncoil. Very slowly, agonizingly slowly, Caleb lowered himself. He didn't bend at the waist, which would have put him hovering over the dog. He bent his knees, sinking into a deep crouch until he was at eye level with the beast. He still didn't look the dog in the eye. He kept his open palm resting gently on his own knee. Ares stepped forward. His massive, scarred head was the size of Caleb's entire torso. The dog pressed his cold, wet nose against Caleb's open palm. Caleb didn't grab the dog. He didn't pet him. He simply let his fingers curl slightly, lightly scratching the soft fur just under the beast's jawline. Ares let out a long, heavy sigh, his eyes fluttering shut. The monster of Oakland, the dog that had maimed grown men and terrified the underworld, slowly lowered his massive body and sat down in the dirt, leaning his heavy shoulder against the frail, mute street kid. "What the?" Tommy whispered, the color draining from his face. The heavy steel door of the clubhouse suddenly groaned open. Out stepped Garrett Hayes, the president of the Oakland chapter. Garrett was a man of terrifying reputation, his face a roadmap of knife scars and hard miles. He had heard the commotion and come out to see what was happening. Garrett stopped dead in his tracks on the patio. He looked at Tommy, then at the unclipped chain, and finally across the dusty yard. He stared in absolute disbelief at the impossible tableau before him, a starving, ragged boy sitting in the dirt, peacefully stroking the head of the most dangerous dog the Hells Angels had ever known. Garrett Hayes, president of the Oakland Hells Angels, descended the concrete steps of the patio with the slow, deliberate heavy-footedness of a man who commanded absolute authority. He wore his leather cut over a faded black t-shirt, the president rocker gleaming dull gold in the harsh afternoon sun. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the scene. Tommy, Garrett's voice was a low gravel that carried effortlessly across the yard. What exactly am I looking at? Tommy Gallagher's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The humiliation of his killer dog being pacified by a 100-pound street urchin was rapidly curdling into uncontrollable rage. He unholstered the heavy Colt 9011 pistol from his waistband, his hands shaking with adrenaline. The little rat crawled under the fence, Garrett. He's stealing club property, and the dog's broken. I'm putting a bullet in both of them. Before Tommy could raise the barrel, Garrett's massive hand clamped down on his wrist like a steel vise. The president didn't yell. His voice dropped an octave, radiating lethal intent. You discharge a weapon at a child in my yard, Tommy, and you won't live to see the sunset. Put it away. Tommy swallowed hard, the bravado evaporating. He holstered the weapon, his chest heaving. Garrett walked slowly toward Caleb and Aries. The massive mastiff didn't growl at the club president, but he did shift his weight, subtly positioning his heavy body between Garrett and the boy. It was a protective maneuver. Garrett paused, his scarred eyebrows raising in genuine surprise. He had known Aries for 2 years. He had seen the dog snap a man's forearm like a dry twig. Now the beast was acting like a guardian. "Look at me, son," Garrett said softly. Caleb slowly lifted his gaze. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just offered that same profound, unreadable stillness. Garrett studied the boy's hollow cheeks, the bruised rings under his eyes, and the faded, oversized clothes. He recognized the look. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a kid who had fallen so far through the cracks of society that he had hit the bedrock. Garrett reached into his denim pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it into the dirt beside the dropped alternator. "Take your scrap, take the cash. Go back through the hole you came from and don't ever cross my fence line again. You understand?" Caleb didn't nod. He gently removed his hand from Aries' fur. The dog let out a soft whine. Caleb picked up the alternator, snatched the $50 bill, and backed away slowly. He didn't turn his back until he was at the fence line. He slid under the chain link and vanished into the shimmering heat of the alley. But Caleb didn't stay away. The encounter had fundamentally altered something inside the silent boy. For years he had been a ghost, ignored or abused by a world that demanded words he couldn't give. But in that dusty yard, for the first time in his life, he had been understood perfectly. 3 days later, just as the sun began to dip below the industrial skyline, Caleb returned to the alley. He didn't crawl under the fence. He simply sat on a discarded milk crate on the outside of the chain link, obscured by overgrown weeds. Inside the compound, chained to his engine block, Aries sensed him immediately. The dog stood, his ears pricking forward. He walked to the absolute limit of his heavy iron chain, sitting exactly opposite the gap in the fence, staring into the weeds. Slowly, Caleb's hand emerged through the diamond-shaped mesh. He held a piece of cold, leftover hamburger he had bought with Garrett's $50. Aries stepped forward, delicately taking the meat from the boy's fingers without letting a single tooth scrape his skin. Thus began the secret communion. Every evening at dusk, Caleb would arrive. He brought whatever scraps he could scavenge, pieces of hot dogs, stale bread, dried beef jerky. That more than food, he brought his silent, calming presence. He would sit for hours by the fence, his fingers laced through the metal, resting against Aries' warm snout. In return, the monstrous dog offered Caleb something he had never experienced: unyielding, unconditional loyalty. Inside the clubhouse, however, the atmosphere was growing toxic. Tommy Gallagher was spiraling out of control. Tommy's aggression wasn't just a personality flaw. It was a symptom of a much deeper, deadlier problem. He was drowning in debt. Unbeknownst to Garrett or the club, Tommy had been skimming from a joint narcotics operation they ran with a ruthless East Bay syndicate known as the Iron Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was run by a man named Arthur Rollins, a former cartel enforcer who did not forgive debts. Tommy owed Arthur $60,000, and Arthur's patience had run out. Paranoia ate at Tommy. He began drinking heavily, his temper snapping at the slightest provocation. He took his fear out on the world around him, and inevitably he took it out on his dog. One evening, Caleb was sitting in his hidden spot behind the fence when the heavy metal door of the clubhouse slammed open. Tommy stumbled out into the yard, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was cursing loudly, kicking a metal trash can across the concrete. Ori stood up, his body tensing. "What you looking at, you useless mutt?" Tommy slurred, staggering toward the engine block. He kicked dirt at the dog. "You used to be a killer. Now you're just a joke." Tommy raised the heavy glass bottle, preparing to strike the dog across the skull. Behind the fence, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He gripped the chain link so hard his knuckles turned white. He was paralyzed by the familiar, suffocating terror of abusive men. But Aries didn't cower. The dog didn't whine. Instead, a terrifying low-frequency rumble erupted from deep within the beast's chest. The amber eyes, which had been so soft when looking at Caleb, snapped back to dead, hollow pits of violence. Aries bared his teeth, the scarred muscles of his shoulders bunching beneath his brindle coat. He was no longer Tommy's broken weapon. He belonged to the boy in the alley, and he would not be struck again. Tommy froze, the bottle raised in mid-air. The sheer, unadulterated menace radiating from the mastiff sobered him up just enough to realize that if he brought that bottle down, the dog would tear his throat out, chain or no chain. Tommy backed away, cursing under his breath. "Whatever. You're dead meat anyway." He stumbled toward his parked motorcycle and roared out at the compound. In the shadows, Caleb let out a shaky breath. He reached his fingers through the fence. Aries immediately dropped his defensive posture, pressing his heavy head against the wire, whining softly to comfort the trembling boy. The lines were drawn, the fuse was lit, and the explosion was only hours away. The storm hit Oakland shortly after midnight on a Friday. Rain lashed against the corrugated tin roofs, turning the Hells Angels compound into a slick, muddy swamp. Outside, in the miserable downpour, Caleb huddled in the back seat of an abandoned Chevrolet Impala, shivering beneath a damp, moving blanket. Inside the yard, Tommy Gallagher was frantic. Standing beneath the garage awning, he dug furiously into the dirt, burying a steel lockbox stuffed with $20,000, the last of the drug money he skimmed. He planned to run tonight, leaving the club to face Arthur Rollins' wrath. He never got the chance. Through the pouring rain, 4 dark figures moved silently down the alley. They were Arthur's hitmen sent to collect blood, not cash. Led by a cold-eyed enforcer named Hector, they found the weak point in the chain link Caleb's gap and snicked it wide open with heavy bolt cutters. Caleb jolted awake. The metallic snap cut through the thunder. Peering through the cracked window, he saw the armed men slipping into the compound. Panic flooded his veins. His first instinct was to run. But then, a sound echoed from the yard. A furious booming bark. Chained to his engine block in the freezing rain, Aries lunged violently at the intruders. He was a 160-pound alarm system, ready to die defending his territory. Hector raised his suppressed rifle, aiming squarely at the mastiff's broad chest. "Quiet the mutt," he hissed. Caleb didn't think. He threw off the blanket, kicked open the rusted car door, and sprinted into the storm. By the garage, Tommy had frozen, his shovel dropping as he stared down the barrels of 4 rifles. "Arthur says hello," Hector sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before Hector could fire, a small hooded figure slid through the mud directly into the line of fire. Caleb hit the dirt next to the engine block. His rain-slick hands fumbled desperately with the heavy iron carabiner on Ares's corner. Click. The chain fell away. Tommy screamed, expecting the beast to turn on him. Hector fired a suppressed shot, the bullet kicking up mud inches from Caleb's face. But Caleb stayed on his knees. He turned toward the hitman and extended his arm, pointing a single, mud-caked finger directly at Hector. It was the first command he had ever given. Ares erupted. Released from his tether, the mastiff became a blur of brindle muscle and pure kinetic fury. Bypassing Tommy completely, he launched himself through the rain. Hector didn't have time to adjust his aim. Ares hit him square in the chest with the force of a speeding truck. The rifle flew away as the dog's jaws clamped onto Hector's tactical vest, crushing the Kevlar and throwing the man backward into the mud. Chaos ignited. The second hitman panicked and fired wildly. A bullet grazed Ares's thick shoulder, tearing through flesh, but the beast didn't flinch. He released Hector and spun, taking the second man down by the thigh with a sickening crunch. The third hitman aimed at the dog's head. Caleb, acting on pure survival instinct, grabbed a heavy tire iron left near the garage. With a silent scream, the 14-year-old hurled the metal bar through the rain. It struck the gunman squarely in the side of his helmet, sending his shot wide. The gunfire was enough. The heavy steel doors of the clubhouse burst open. Garrett Hayes, Dutch, and half a dozen patched members poured onto the patio, racking shotguns and drawing pistols. Contact front. Garrett roared, seeing the heavily armed bikers and their leader incapacitated by a demonic dog. The remaining hitmen broke. They dragged their bleeding comrade toward the fence and scrambled into the night, leaving Hector groaning in the mud. Silence fell over the yard, save for the pounding rain. Garrett lowered his shotgun and stepped into the mud. He looked at the wounded hitman, then at the half-buried lockbox of cash. The truth of the betrayal washed over him instantly. Tommy, trembling uncontrollably, tried to stand. Garrett, thank God, they tried to kill me. The dog, he saved me. Ares, bleeding from the graze on his shoulder, ignored Tommy completely. The massive dog limped over to Caleb, who was kneeling in the dirt, and let out a low, protective growl, baring his teeth at Tommy. Step closer, and you die. Garrett walked up to Tommy. Without a word, he grabbed the enforcer by his leather cut and ripped the Hell's Angels patch clean off his back. You brought a hit squad to my door. You skimmed from the club, you're out, Garrett said coldly. You have 60 seconds to walk out that gate before I let the dog finish what those men started. Stripped of his colors and his weapon, Tommy turned and ran into the rain. Garrett approached Caleb. The boy was shivering violently, his hand resting gently on Ares's bleeding shoulder. The hardened outlaw knelt in the mud, bringing himself to Caleb's eye level. You saved my club tonight, son, Garrett said softly, unzipping his dry leather jacket and wrapping it around Caleb's shoulders. And it looks like you finally found his off switch. Dutch, get the first aid kit for the dog. Set up a cot in the back office. Garrett looked back at the silent street kid. You're not sleeping in the alley anymore. He's your dog now. Come on inside. Caleb stood up. He didn't need a leash. He simply patted his leg twice. Ares, the monster of San Leandro, fell into step right beside him, following the boy out of the cold rain and into the warmth of home. If you were moved by Caleb and Ares's incredible true-to-life survival story, where an unbreakable bond of silence conquered a world of violence, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with fellow animal lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding, real-life tales. What did you think of Ares' loyalty? Drop a comment down below to let us know.